Okay, so is everybody ready for us to get started? And of course, as I say that, Samantha, is it possible for me to share my screen?
Of course, the share screen option should be available.
Okay, well, oh, there we go. I just had to open the full.
Yeah, sometimes how it's green freaks people out, but it should be good.
All right, can everybody see my screen? Okay, good. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I don't think at the moment see the chat. So if you have a question, speak up. Also, of course, if I'm experiencing technical difficulties, you can't see my slides, can't hear me, something like that, go ahead and give me a shout. But this is returning to tomorrow, municipal planning and urban renewal efforts in Minneapolis, Kansas City, and Omaha, 1940 to 1960. My name is Dustin Gann. I'm going to chair this panel as well as be the first presenter. I am currently an assistant. Actually, I just got promoted, an associate professor at Midland University in Fremont, Nebraska, as well as coordinator of the honors program. In 1946, General Chairman of the Citywide Improvement Plan Committee in Omaha, in Omaha said, "To the city, the means of transportation are as vital as arteries are to the human body." He went on to say that in the past year, the growth and prospective expansion in the air transport field indicates definitely that will be necessary if Omaha is to maintain its present prominent position for facilities to be provided greater than what anticipated even just a year ago. This was in September of 1946. A month later in October, he said, quote, "Omahans who have long turned their noses up at the city's dusty, creaking auditorium will have a chance to do something about it in the November 5th election." He pointed out that the objective for the improvement is to develop Omaha into one of the nation's most progressive cities. And he urged Omahans to keep in mind the citywide improvement plan slogan, "Omaha vision is your decision." Now, this was in 1946. 4 years later, in 1950, the African-American publisher of the Kansas City Call would write an editorial praising that city, Kansas City, for its treatment of African-Americans during the city's Centennial celebration in the summer of 1950. Chester A. Franklin writes, quote, "The Kansas City Centennial Committee is to be congratulated for the non-segregation policy, which is in effect at events held in connection with Kansas City's 100-year anniversary. No incidents have come to our attention in which Negro spectators have received treatment any different from any other citizen. Seats have been sold on a first-come, first-served basis, both for the thrills of a century pageant in Swope Park and at numerous events in the municipal auditorium. There have been no attempt to set aside, quote, unquote, certain sections for Negroes." Franklin continued, quote, "It is appropriate that in its 100th birthday year, Kansas City grow up and take on big city ways. It is like coming of age of a man at 21 years. It is time to put away childish habits and customs. Segregation and discrimination based upon race, color, or religion are among the habits that should be shelved as this great metropolis goes into its second century. The policy can be continued when the special event is over and the theater becomes a permanent part of Kansas City's recreation program." Now, 46 to 55 years later, in 1955, the Centennial Committee in Minneapolis created a book for the publicity of the event, Minneapolis, a City of Opportunity. And in the foreword, the book was described as, quote, "not intended as a formal history, designed solely to commemorate the Minneapolis Centennial. We have attempted, however, to sketch in words and pictures something of the color and romance, the vivid personalities, and the growth of business, industry, government, education, and the arts that have marked the city's story." Further, readers were told, quote, "The growth of Minneapolis and the growth of industry have been largely simultaneous processes. It seemed appropriate, therefore, to invite a number of outstanding Minneapolis businesses to share in the sponsorship of this volume," which is an incredibly fancy way to say that this is corporate advertising. Now, the reason I start my presentation with these three disparate examples of what's going on in Minneapolis, Kansas City, and Omaha is that we're talking about a historical moment at mid-century where each of the cities confronts both their past, but also where they want to go with their future. Now, the historian Judith Austin asked in 1987, when 6 Western states were gaining the centennial of their statehood, quote, "Why beyond the excuse for a good long party in which we dress in costumes and have beard growing contests, should we bother with a centennial celebration?" Now, I'm going to argue in my paper today that the centennial celebration marks a moment where cities confront who they were and what they want to become. Now, to Austin's point, we're going to see beard growing contests aplenty. These are photographs from Kansas City's beard growing contests. I would point out that the University of Nebraska Omaha Gateway newspaper in 1954 published an article under the headline, "Take Heart, Girls, Bristles Delayed." It starts with a description of an OU male sitting nonchalantly in philosophy class, smoothing his beard and mustache with a small wire brush. But why have his buddies stopped growing beards, the article asks? Because it says, in order to qualify for, quote, "man with the best beard" contest in the Omaha Centennial celebration, they're not permitted to start growing until June 23rd. From June 23rd to September 11th, that's when the whiskers may be grown. Now, I would note here, of course, Michael, I saw you stroking your beard, and I would do the same. It's sort of second nature when you hear this, that the article concludes by saying, quote, "Despite many unsanitary complaints against beards, Dr. Edward Lehman, City County Health Director, said no action will be taken against them." Now, this is, again, mixing sort of the frivolous with the serious, but as Austin noted, this is one of the consistents with centennials. So why are they worthy of historical study? Again, I would argue that centennials are going to be a focus for municipal planners. They're going to be a focus for civic leaders and for the residents of those communities. In addition, they are consistent, maybe not in time, certainly with what year is celebrated, but the event that's commemorated. So they give us a bit of consistency. They eliminate some of the variables in terms of historical study. Now, this paper is part of a larger project which examines post-World War II municipal anniversaries celebrated throughout the Midwest and West in communities including Salt Lake in 1947, Kansas City in 1950, Omaha in 54, Minneapolis and Sioux Falls in 56, Denver in 58. Essentially, in this post-World War II moment, there are a range of communities that are what I would say sort of perched on a precipice of optimism. It's in the post-war lull where the economy is booming. There's faith in technology, faith in the future. And before the civil rights movement has really fractured many of these municipalities along racial lines. That optimism we saw from Chester Franklin in 1950 is not going to be present in Kansas City in 1960. So this project investigates the contested nature of urban development, historical memory, and municipal space. I focus on the interrelated and not always coordinated efforts of civic leaders, i.e. elected officials, Chamber of Commerce members, business owners, tourism boards, and the local citizens. What is the interplay between these different constituencies? How do they shape the celebration? Many communities are going to view centennial celebrations as an opportunity to celebrate heritage, expand regional economic influence, and revitalize the city's regional and national reputation. Though designed to unify residents, entrenched, often exclusionary local interests spearhead these events. The decisions organizers make in terms of inclusion, both regarding which voices shape event planning and who could ultimately attend and participate, are going to vary widely. Now, municipal anniversaries, to the focus of this paper, often spur development or redevelopment of public parks, neighborhoods, and areas of commercial or economic importance. These celebrations aspire to present a sanitized version of the community to visitors and precariously balance the glorification of frontier heritage with optimistic boosterism. We've already heard a little bit of that from Minneapolis, where essentially it's turned over to corporate and certainly commercial interests to publicize the celebration. Consequently, a comparative examination reveals how disparate communities use these events to address questions of economic vitality and implement civic planning initiatives. Now, one of the questions that's going to be asked as these events get going is, what does a municipality need to be successful? And which other cities does a municipality identify as its competition? Do they emulate their rivals, or do they try to differentiate themselves? And that's where we'll see a helpful sort of graphic here in terms of the comparison of the cities that we're looking at. Now, certainly I've grouped them together because of the Midwest focus. I mentioned Denver and Salt Lake celebrate roughly in a similar period. But with Minneapolis, Omaha, and Kansas City, certainly we're going to see a lot of similarity in terms of their relative geography, as well as some of the issues that they face. Now, I would point out that Chicago is going to celebrate about a decade earlier its centennial, and it's going to coincide with one of the world's fairs. I would argue that Minneapolis, Omaha, and Kansas City all see Chicago relatively as their regional rival. Now, when we think about these cities, we're going to see a comparative study be necessary for the region. Certainly, these are three exemplary cities. Moreover, we're going to see the Centennial, as I alluded to a moment ago, be that sort of consistency in terms of it's a moment where the city has been gearing up for its moment in the sun. How do they prepare for that? How do they plan for that? Okay. Now, you note the little asterisks here. Each of these cities, Kansas City and Minneapolis in particular, are going to celebrate their centennial multiple times. And if you're asking how that's possible, think about who's making the decisions in terms of local boosters, Chamber of Commerce, who want any excuse they can to drive traffic. Now, again, relative similarities. This comes from the 1940 census. We can see the relative shared space of these three cities. Omaha shares the river with Council Bluffs. Kansas City, of course, is separated by the state line. And Minneapolis, St. Paul are going to be the twin cities. So each of them has a bit of an identity crisis, as it were, with neighbors. Each of them thinks of themselves certainly as the center of a vast trade territory. Again, if we think about this relative location. But when that's the case, how do you separate yourself from this, from your neighbors, so to speak? So when we think about the municipal character of each of these cities, we think about Kansas City, Omaha, and Minneapolis. And I've grouped them in this way because it's 50, 54, and 56. I realized after I turned in my title that I had gotten my chronological order wrong. Hopefully no one will judge me too harshly for that. But when we think about the municipal character in each of these locations, Kansas City is going to be coming off by the time of its centennial of the Pendergast era and in a recently completed 10-year plan. They passed the 10-year plan in 1928. It essentially serves as the blueprint for federal spending that's funneled into Pendergast-led projects throughout the Depression. And during the Centennial, as we'll see, they upgrade infrastructure in terms of the Starlight Theater, internal highway improvements, as well as lighting. Projects begun prior to the Centennial that will be finished after the Centennial. In Omaha, we see a relatively different story. Omaha is the smaller of the three cities at this point. Relative population, 1940, Kansas City has 634 plus residents. Omaha just shy of 290,000. Minneapolis at 911,000. Okay, so we're seeing each of these cities having grown over the 1930 and 1940, but relatively smaller. Also in Omaha, we see private sector development more than public in terms of the Knights of Exarban. And I don't want to tell you how long I lived in Nebraska before I realized Exarban is Nebraska backwards. Now, in Minneapolis, we see celebration and self-promotion from an earlier period. The Aquatennial is going to be established in 1940, and increasingly influential suburbs, which is going to be important in just a moment. Now, we look at each of these and go through some of the visuals that I have. Kansas City Centennial Association, I would note here, certainly not going through each of these committees, but look at the relative sophistication in terms of its organization. Also note in terms of the administrative committee, it is chaired by William Kemp, who is the mayor at this point. So this is a publicly led celebration that is connected to municipal government in Kansas City. That's going to be different from private celebrations in both Omaha and Minneapolis. What I would also note is the visual here of connecting the past with the present. 1850 to 1950, one of my prized possessions is a sheet of these stamps that I have hanging in my office on the other wall that you can't see. But then this is an illustration, the old Kansas City Spirit young fellow, connecting again, reaching across the past. We see again the stamp, the Centennial program. These are going to be common in terms of Centennial programs that are published. Again, we heard from Minneapolis's at the beginning of the presentation. And just some of the photos of the event committee. Again, William Kemp here in terms of the Kansas City mayor. The parade, which of course, square dancing, always important. Now, I would note here in terms of the schedule, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, but the Epperson Minstrel Show which is exactly what the name implies in terms of a minstrel show in blackface. It performs 12th, 13th, 14th, 16th, and 17th is the Beau Brummel Club, the all-Negro cast in a tuneful, high-stepping musical. We see that juxtaposition of race, but certainly we also see the industrial exposition for the production possibilities in Kansas City. Parade, and then some of the partners in progress in the publication. Infrastructure with promotion. Now, this is the Starlight Theater, one of the things that we will see constructed specifically for the Centennial. Again, I said the Beau Brummel Club and the Minstrel Show. Notice both of these receive full page treatment in the Kansas City magazine. And here's Chester Franklin, who we heard from at the beginning, who positively portrays the Kansas City Centennial. In fact, a photographer for the Kansas City Call, William Fombro, will win the beard growing contest in the 1950 Centennial. Omaha, 54, 4 years later, we have the Centennial calendar of events, similar mix of parades, art festivals. Certainly we will see the idea of representation, festivals of nations, Forum of the Future for the science and education, some of the similar idea. Unlike one of our fellow presenters yesterday who sang his presentation promotion on Twitter, I will not sing the Omaha song to you this afternoon, but suffice it to say it's a catchy little tune. Parade, again, very common. But one thing that I would note here in terms of some of the publicity, certainly as it is trickling down from major publications to the Gateway, which is at UNO, but also certainly we see the official seal, the idea of representation, an article about real Indians, their words, not mine, being included in this celebration because of their contributions to Omaha. Now, Minneapolis in 56, we see pre-existing celebrations, as I alluded to earlier. Aquatennial is established in 1939, 1940. It's plugged in for the Centennial. Now, what's especially important here for Minneapolis is who's going to be in terms of the planning. The individuals tapped for the committee include Ray C. Ewald, Donald Dayton, Philip Pillsbury, Arthur Gluick, and Clint Morrison. And if you know anything about Minneapolis history, these are important names. Ray Ewald represents dairy and agriculture. He's part of Ewald's Dairy. Donald Dayton is a real estate magnate who has a store, a family retail business, the Dayton Company, who had just opened their first suburban store in 1956, Philip Pillsbury of the milling community, and Arthur Gluick of Gluick Brewing. There's another member, Clint Morrison, who is a representative of the First National Bank as well. But notice that there is not a connection to municipal government in Minneapolis as there was in Kansas City, but industry is certainly prominent. Certainly Southdale Center, again, with Donald Dayton and the opening of the first suburban store in 1956, the agrarian and milling tradition of Minneapolis, but horse to motor bus, Twin City Lines, Minneapolis growing together. The idea of infrastructure, certainly in terms of Minneapolis, the most notable infrastructure is going to be the creation of Centennial Plaza, located at 6th Street and 2nd Avenue. The venue is sponsored by First National Bank, Clint Morrison on the planning committee. The bank donates the land to Clear, and they indicate that they receive control of the plaza for daily programs and exhibits to run through the summer months, changing the infrastructure of Minneapolis and serving as a boost for future redevelopment. So I would argue, again, throughout this brief presentation of my material on the Centennial, that these events unite for a moment, but also foreshadow what's to come in terms of municipal development. So I will stop sharing there, give back control to the group, and we will move to the second presentation. If you're ready, John.
I'm ready.
Okay, so John is up next. John defended his dissertation on March 13th of 2020 at Western Michigan. He currently teaches as an adjunct at Grand Rapids Community College, and he's had articles published in agricultural history, one of which was awarded the John Townley Award for Best Paper Published in the Mining History Journal. Take it away, John.
All right, thank you for that. I'm going to shift away from post-war cities to 1890s through 1910 rural Midwest, specifically, woods. And so this paper, Factory in the Woods, explores the people who made the cutover and who provided the crucial labor necessary to supply the raw materials that fed America's expansion in the late 19th and early 20th century. So for these people who came, many of whom would be classified as farmers too, and I'll get into that later. But for those people, here the rural Midwest represented not farming, but actually remote factories in the woods where they met conditions that would be similar to those in a factory, but perhaps a bit more harsher in terms of just the remoteness. So this, what I'll present today, is just a small part of this chapter from my dissertation, and the larger project I'm working on is based on this dissertation. And the larger project is entitled Beyond the Farm, which argues that contrary to both academic and general perceptions, working in the rural Midwest was not just about farming. Looking beyond it and examining other economic initiatives encourages a more complex, yet far more accurate image of the everyday lives of rural Midwesterners. Farming is important, but what I show is logging, mining, and tourism, and that's what I discuss in the larger project, which the dissertation is turning into. And really, I argue that really they came to this particular region, but really regions throughout the area, because they knew that although they knew farming would be difficult, but they also had, availability to do a variety of other occupations, maybe in the hope of farming full-time or maybe just to get by. But really, it really shows that in this part of rural America, the image of the independent yeoman farmer was never a reality. And I just have statistics from this area, about 24 to 48% of their income was not coming from farms. Only about 41 to 46% was directly coming from like crops or agriculture. Now this was the cutover region, but it's really just, you got to look at sort of this integrated economic approach. And, reading the oral interviews, which I didn't conduct, but which form really the core primary resource, it's just every farmer was out working in the woods in the winter for extra income, whether, it was a common experience. So that's what I'm talking about. Specifically in this paper, I'm just going to highlight how they worked in an ungiving environment based in remote, isolated camps directed under the watchful eye of supervisors. But even before they even got to lumber camps, workers interacted with unscrupulous employment agencies and lumber companies and had to travel long distances often to get to logging camps. These locations were spaces where foremen and their subordinate supervisors enforced the rules that dictated camp regimen in overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and unsanitary bunkhouses. Sort of demystifying this Paul Bunyan image, which the more you read about the oral interviews and the conditions, no doubt some of that masculinity was manufactured to compensate for just the lack of control they had. And I'll just point out a couple examples. So, getting a job was very difficult. We got to remember these are located in remote locations. These factories are, right? They're not located in cities. And the state of Minnesota heard so many complaints getting into the progressive area, they investigated an assortment of abuses by employment agencies these lumbering companies used. And a common source of complaint workers had was that lumber companies accused men of being fraudulent if they did not stay on for a set duration after they arrived at a camp. So you would sign up at an employment agency, and get your railroad ticket out to a camp, but you had to work there for, let's say, a month. And if you didn't work there for a month, you were going to get fined. But you also got to remember that you just can't have this image of just getting up and leaving like the big tough lumberjack. Your only way home is on a company railroad. So it's just, in a lot of circumstances, they're just trapped in this circumstance. But The Department of Labor, Industry, and Commerce of Minnesota said that these actions were frequently used as a club against honest working men who themselves have been victims of fraud and misrepresentation, and were used to keep men in a state of peonage. And so here's an example. One workman was hired by a Minneapolis employment agency to work in a logging camp. His wage was to be $35 a month, though if he did not last the entire season, he would have to pay the lumber company back for the railroad fare. He only lasted 29 days, for which he garnered $1 a day. The company subtracted $9.50 for the railroad fare, took out $1.35 for a hospital fee, an additional $2.15 for the commissary items, drawing him near $15 for his labors. In another instance, two immigrants were often taken advantage of in this circumstance. Like, two of them were supposed to make $35 a month. They get there, they said they're only working for $26. They want to leave. And then what the lumber companies would do is actually just send out local police men to arrest them for committing fraud. And one local district attorney refused to press charges. Instead, he wrote, "You can readily see that this law is a club in the hands of loggers and other employers of common labor where railroad fare has been advanced, as the men are threatened or coerced into staying in camp when they would be perfectly justified in leaving." So, it's just sort of these common things. And the conditions at camp, so, when they get to the camps, the conditions throughout the time period are familiar throughout this upper Great Lakes region. Lumber camps were really corridors of control, spaces where foremen and their subordinate supervisors dictated camp regimen and maintained firm control over lumberjacks. And observers in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota all noted the deplorable conditions of these temporary work sites. A Michigan investigator wrote that the settings he inspected were below the minimum of decent earning and living. Wisconsin said they found men's sleeping quarters were unfit for occupancy even by animals. And in some of the worst camps, the accommodations for the horses were better than those for the men. Very inadequate. Lice were common. Loggers would exclaim that lice roamed the camps, and the pests appeared in great and unbelievable numbers, making conditions unbearable. The bunks are really close together. It was pretty easy for lice to go from one bunk to the other. Lice made sleeping impossible, and on their only day off, Sunday, lumberjacks spent most of the day boiling their clothes in a vain attempt to rid themselves of lice, not life. So just some of the conditions, and I'm not going to get into actually the work which I do in the larger project or the larger chapter, but just some of these facets. And again, lumberjacks did so even off work, is in the bunkhouse and the eating house, their actions are tightly scrutinized. For example, whilst they struggled through these deplorable conditions in the bunkhouses, lumberjacks did so in the scrutiny of the bull cook, who, along with straw bosses, enforced rules that established and maintained company control in camps. The bull cook did not cook, rather he performed maintenance and sort of limited thing. And men did certainly sit around and chew tobacco and talk in the bunkhouses. However, they did so knowing the bull cook or a straw boss would report to the foreman any particular damning discussion. Any such communication ended abruptly after 9 o'clock when the bull would come, and when he says, "Go to sleep, boys," you have to go to sleep. This meant no talk either. But even while eating in the dining hall, it was further evidence. The men ate breakfast and dinner all together in one setting, and while eating, they remained entirely silent. The men ate while sitting on benches, and they sat in the same place all of the time, but it was just, there's no conversation at all. One logger described the scene and said, "The men never dared talk. It was absolutely against the rules for the men to talk while eating. If any man started a conversation, the cookies and the cook would get him off by the scruff of the neck and out he would go. Once in a while, you would see whispered conversations, but you would see the cook flare over there and start walking towards them. The men were as afraid of the cook as any child ever was of a schoolmaster. So again, even off work time is being difficult. But still today, logging is one of the most dangerous industries, and this was more especially true then. But again, consider that remoteness of being so far away that, if an accident happens, there's little in the way of first aid care, right? One lumberjack recounted a narrow escape when a tree jumped the stump and fell the opposite way it was supposed to go, which is very common if you're not paying. He could not move out of the way because the logs scattered on the ground, so he laid down. The trees fell upon the logs above him, but it was good fortune that he didn't die, right? But cold weather also had a devastating effect. One night, when the temperature dropped to 45 degrees, a water wagon crew went out to ice the roads to make it easier to transport. The teamster driving wore a bandana handkerchief around his face with just his eyes showing to try to protect it, but it was too cold. When he removed his bandana, the tip of his nose came off with it because it has frozen white. And again, there's little in the way of first aid. So the remoteness of most labor camps intensified this problem. One lumberjack recounted how he lost a good friend when a log came down and hit him while moving along. He stayed with his friend for several hours before the foreman found a crew willing to take him to Red Lake, which is about 50 miles from the camp, and then to Bemidji, an extensive, long one-way trip. On the route, he tried to talk to his friend, but his friend never answered. His friend was dead, and the lumberjack said the two had planned to trap the following winter, but that got knocked on its head. So this is just a brief overview of a very common work experience in the rural Midwest, right? Before the land became cut over, workers had to endure these harsh conditions under the close supervision of lumber companies' officials. And so the lived reality of lumberjacks was one of constant struggle, dealing with shady employment agency and unscrupulous lumber companies. And just, a danger, accident, and death were common experiences. With that, I look forward to any sort of feedback with this or the larger project as well. So thank you all for listening.
Thanks, John. We'll have time for questions at the end. So our final presenter is Michael J. Mullen. He's a professor of history at Augustana University and currently the university's chair of regional history. He has twice received the Vernon and Mildred Niebuhr Faculty Excellence Award for teaching, as well as the Frederick C. Kohlmeyer Distinguished Teaching Professor Award. He's had articles appear in Mid-America, Historical Review, the American Indian Culture and Research Journal, and South Dakota History. Take it away, Michael.
Thank you. Until April 2020, it is doubtful that most Sioux Falls residents gave much thought to one of its iconic employers, Smithfield Foods. This is somewhat surprising given the fact that Smithfield is Sioux Falls' third largest employer. However, unlike the two largest employers, Sanford and Avera Health Systems, Smithfield has long since lost its place as the gateway to the middle class. As was the case throughout the meatpacking industry, wages had stagnated since the mid-1980s. One result of this income decline was that Smithfield employees were now more likely to be immigrants and refugees than good Caucasians. This stands in stark contrast to the historic employment pattern of the plant, where American-born and regionally recruited employees made up more than 95% of the workforce. That is why, when Smithfield Foods experienced an outbreak of COVID-19 among its workers, the Sioux Falls community's collective response centered around those people. That many Sioux Falls residents felt a distance between themselves and the meatpackers indicates how different Sioux Falls is today from its 20th century roots, where working at John Morrell and Company meant economic security and social mobility. The story of meatpacking in Sioux Falls, then, is the story of a city's growth and evolution. By the late 1980s, meatpacking employed fewer than 3.5% of the Sioux Falls workforce. It has shrunk since then. But for most of the 20th century, John Morrell and Company was the largest employer in Sioux Falls and the second largest employer in the state of South Dakota. At one time, nearly 20% of the city's labor force worked for John Morrell. Despite the growing sense that Sioux Falls has moved beyond meatpacking, it is difficult to imagine Sioux Falls without a meatpacking plant. Now, John Morrell and Company owned the meatpacking plant in Sioux Falls for most of the 20th century. Smithfield Foods purchased the plant in 1995. In 2013, Smithfield sold the plant to Shanghu International Holdings. Whoever the owner, the meatpacking plant remains an important, if often overlooked, economic cornerstone of the Sioux Falls economy. John Morrell and the Sioux Falls stockyards, located directly across the street from the packing plant, drove Sioux Falls' emergence as the region's economic linchpin. Before examining some of the moments in John Morrell's Sioux Falls history, it's important for the listener to understand the subtle ways John Morrell and Company influenced Sioux Falls. The presence of the plant along the Big Sioux River and what is now Rice Street influenced the placement of the city's wastewater treatment plant. It dictated which roads were paved first. The first paved highway in Minnehaha County, for example, ran from Canton to Del Rapids and directly east of the Morrell plant. The reason for this is that South Dakota farmers were some of the most dependent providers of trucks in delivering their animals as opposed to trains. They delivered their animals by truck and needed the paved roads. Later, the two interstates that converge on Sioux Falls provided similar access. In town, nearly 700 automobiles brought 1,950 workers to the Morrell plant daily in the early 1930s. Paved roads became the order of the day. As time went on, Morrell workers shaped some of the distinct neighborhoods of Sioux Falls, particularly in the north end of town and the northeast side of town. While its workers lived in Sioux Falls, Morrell's required the input of the countryside for its existence. And so, with the assistance of the Sioux Falls stockyards, farmers brought their cattle, hogs, and even sheep to town nearly every day of the year. Agricultural producers who came to Sioux Falls could drop off their animals at the stockyards in the morning, have breakfast at the Stockyards Cafe, see their animals sold later in the morning, and then shop along Phillips Avenue in the afternoon. By the time the producer left town later that day, many of the livestock they delivered had traveled across the street, technically in a tunnel underneath the street, to the John Morrell plant where they had been butchered earlier in the afternoon. As for the Phillips merchants, they had more receipts in the till because of the producer's presence. It's in this manner that Sioux Falls became the focal point or regional capital of the surrounding countryside. Now, John Morrell and Company was not the first meat packer in Sioux Falls. The first efforts at meat packing began in 1883, but the city condemned the plant as a nuisance due to the odors the plant produced. And this is why John Morrell was moved to the east side of town and down the river. Two other efforts, one in 1885, another in 1890, attempted to establish Sioux Falls as a meatpacking center. These efforts also failed. By 1900, and I quote, meatpacking in Sioux Falls remained confined largely to the operations of local butchers. In 1905, however, E.R. Green of Sioux Falls opened the Green Packing Plant. It operated sporadically, and it was this facility that John Morrell and Company president Thomas D. Foster leased and later bought when he decided to expand Morrell's footprint beyond Owatonna, Iowa in 1909. John Morrell and Company had arrived in Sioux Falls. I'm going to skip this little section about the change in agricultural production that accompanies John Morrell, but the most important thing is suddenly when John Morrell arrives, corn rather than wheat becomes the crop of choice in the southeastern portions of South Dakota. Now, what makes John Morrell important historically? Morrell was the first company in South Dakota to offer paid vacations to its employees. Any worker who had worked for a year and it met some specific criteria was eligible. In 1925, the first year that vacations were offered, 245 Sioux Falls plant employees took advantage of a 1-week paid vacation. The Morrell magazine published where they went and what they did, so you could keep track of them and feel somewhat jealous. This is just one way Morrell and Company changed the workers' experience in Sioux Falls. People wanted to work at this progressive company. Eventually, John Morrell and Company would also offer a pension plan, but that would come later and after a major strike in 1935. Morrell's growth buoyed Sioux Falls. Within 2 years of opening, Morrell had a regional impact of $25 million a year. Having begun with the ability to process 200 to 500 head daily, expansion allowed the company to process in ever greater numbers. By 1920, 11 years after its opening, the Sioux Falls Stockyards was selling Morrell and Company 265,333 animals a year. By 1938, the company was processing 24,581,000 animals a year. These numbers meant a significant number of visitors, and that is a byproduct, the growth of Phillips Avenue in downtown Sioux Falls. Unlike meatpacking plants elsewhere, Morel drew its workers from the surrounding countryside. Until the 1980s, Morels did not depend on immigrant labor. And unlike Omaha, Nebraska, and Fort Worth, Texas, Morels never recruited African Americans to break a labor strike. This fact helps explain why Sioux Falls was one of the whitest cities in the United States for much of the 20th century. As the largest employer in town, Morel drew its workers from the children of South Dakota's original settlers, overwhelmingly Northern European in origin. For the few who were not citizens, Morel encouraged and celebrated their decisions to become citizens. Most of these workers in the factory were male, but there were also some women who worked at the plant. Initially, the only women employed at the Sioux Falls plant worked in the administrative offices, not on the line. This was not unique to Sioux Falls, but this did change with the coming of World War II. By the time the war ended, women worked in 68% of the departments in the Sioux Falls plant. And shortly after the war, women found themselves being restricted to certain areas of the plant, most often areas that did not require the use of a knife. Meatpackers continue to funnel women into specific areas of the meatpacking enterprise. And this is important because the areas they send women to tend to limit promotions, and they tend to be paid less than line workers using a knife. Whether male or female, workers for most of the 20th century, as I've said, were drawn from within the region. One of those drawn to a job at John Morel was Ralph Dally, originally from northern Minnesota, and for John, the son of a lumberjack. Ralph arrived in Sioux Falls shortly after World War II. His timing was fortuitous. The labor unrest that created Local 304A was over. Working at John Morel's now offered an opportunity to become middle class. Workers had steady hours and good pay. The job allowed workers to send their children to college. For nearly a century, working the line at John Morel's meant the next generation of family members would have options unavailable to earlier generations. Ralph Dally spent nearly 40 years working at John Morel and Company. He sent his son Nathan to Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. Nate's brothers and sisters also had the opportunity to attend university. None of them chose meatpacking as a career, but Nate and his siblings did work in the plant during their college summers to offset the cost of their college experience. Today, Nate Dally wears a suit and tie to work every day. He works with the Sioux Falls Area Community Foundation in donor relations. Nate's career is what many Morel employees hoped their children's future would be. Unfortunately, working in the meatpacking plant is no longer seen as a stepping stone into the middle class. The late 1980s and early 1990s saw profound changes in meatpacking and the wages company paid. By 2013, meatpacking workers' real wages were 40% less than they had been 40 years earlier. Declining wages have a ripple effect for the community of Sioux Falls. The Sioux Falls School District, for example, finds more and more of its students qualifying for free and reduced lunches. More than 12 of our schools have a 50% or higher percentage of students requiring free or reduced lunches. Employment in meatpacking might offer an alternative to poverty, but it no longer provides an opportunity to join the middle class. Now, the reason Ralph Dally was able to provide for his family was that he worked at John Morel between the two most important labor strikes in Sioux Falls history. These two strikes define John Morel and Company's relationship with Sioux Falls and perhaps South Dakota as a whole. The first strike occurred in 1935 and lasted until 1937. The second strike took place in 1987. The first work stoppage eventually produced one of the strongest labor unions in South Dakota, Local 304A. The second strike eventually broke the union, and some might say unions in general within South Dakota. The next part of my paper deals with the strikes and some of the details, and I, for the sake of time, won't go into this. But there was an oral history collected by the university in the late 1970s, early 1970s, of some of the workers that participated in the 1935 strike. And this is what one of those interviewees said. As one participant noted, and I quote, "There's no doubt that the strike was worth it. They were very tough times, but definitely worth it. I realize it each month when my pension check comes in the mail, or each time they take care of my hospitalization or prescription needs. These are things that never could have been realized without the strike of 1935. Now, the post-World War II year saw labor peace, and John Morrell's Sioux Falls plant dominated the Sioux Falls employment. A steady supply of men and women spent their entire careers at John Morrell. As late as 1976, Morrell employed more than twice as many workers as any other business in Sioux Falls. If the strike of 1935 created the 20th century American Union in Sioux Falls, the labor contracts of 1983 and 1985 marked how fundamentally changed meat packing had become at the end of the 20th century. The emergence of IBP as a major meat packer created a new dynamic within meat packing. IBP not only worked to mechanize as much of the process as it could, but it also refused to abide by the long-established master contract, which had guided management labor relations across the industry. IBP's actions forced old-time packers such as John Morrell and Company or George A. Hormel and Company to become more efficient, meaning management sped up the production line. To become more viable, the old meat packers had to reduce wages, and the process began in Sioux Falls in 1983. The 1983 contract reduced or cut hourly wages by $2.44 an hour. Workers went from making over $10 an hour to a base rate of $8.75. And just so people understand, the minimum wage in 1983 was $3.35 an hour. Okay, so they're still being paid more than double the minimum wage, but they've taken a close to 25% cut in pay. Morrell's management claimed that the cut was necessary because meat processing had become unskilled labor, not skilled labor work. And following IBP's lead, Morrell had simplified each worker's task. This led to a series of strikes in 1986. Those strikes the strike lasted 12 weeks. It produced very terrible labor management relations, and it set the stage for what happened in 1987. In 1987, John Morrell faced another labor strike, this time in Sioux City. And the Sioux City strike affected the workers in Sioux Falls. The Sioux City strikers set up a picket line in Sioux Falls, and the union workers refused to cross it. And for that reason, the company sued the union for an illegal strike, claiming that their 1986 contract forbid them from strike. Initially, the union won its case that the strike was okay, but Morrell appealed and won in federal court. The verdict, a punitive damages worth $24.8 million. The verdict amounted to nearly half the total assets of the 1.4 million person union. The verdict doomed the union. The lawsuit bled into contract negotiations for the next contract, and after 8 different efforts to find common ground, the company simply declared an impasse and unilaterally imposed an additional 18% cut in pay to workers. Breaking the union created a new dynamic at John Morrell. No longer were workers American-born. Instead, the new workers Morrell drew were recently resettled refugees and immigrants from outside the area. Sponsors of the new arrivals placed the refugees in neighborhoods surrounding the meatpacking plant, neighborhoods previously occupied by earlier John Morrell workers. Those former workers had either retired, and some left Sioux Falls entirely, or had moved to other areas because they could no longer afford their homes. Lutheran Social Services was at the forefront. This was considered a good job, and they encouraged their recent arrivals to do it. This produced an interesting dynamic. While longtime residents might comment on the growing diversity of Sioux Falls, a diversity led by John Morrell and its employers, what people were really talking about was the transition from white to people of color as employees in Sioux Falls, in John Morrell, and this fits within a national trend within meatpacking. New meatpacking employees were not only people of color, but they were non-unionized. More and more workers refused to join the union, and this coincided with declining wages. Fortunately for Sioux Falls, other industries had arrived during this decline in wages. Think credit cards. More recently, think healthcare. Longtime residents in Sioux Falls now look to white-collar positions at Citibank, Wells Fargo, and other enterprises for their careers. The result, John Morrell became the domain of resettled refugees and Latinx workers. There is now a divide between John Morrell workers and the longtime residents of Sioux Falls.
Mr. Mullen, you appear to be muted.
Thank you so much. I don't know how I did that, but I'll just, so did you hear declining wages? Declining wages, a new workforce model, and other opportunities allowed longtime residents to consign meat packing to Sioux Falls Past. They did this despite John Morrell being the city's largest employer as late as 1992. Still, other industrial occupations emerged to push meat packing down the pecking order when it came to employment. Credit card payments, education, and healthcare all jumped above Morrell's in terms of employing Sioux Falls residents. As Smithfield entered the 21st century then, the future of Sioux Falls looked beyond the local agricultural sector for its economic future. Still, Morrell's remains an entry point for some of Sioux Falls' newest residents to establish themselves in an ever-changing city. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks for catching him being muted. I thought for a second it was my machine, not his, so I was trying to troubleshoot that. But I would open it up for questions for any of our panelists. You could unmute and ask, or you could put it in the chat, and then I would read and ask the question of whoever you indicated. Well, I have a question for you, Michael. You mentioned that the meatpacking plant would publicize in it sounds like a fascinating book, the vacation destinations of its employees. Do you happen to know any of those destinations?
So for the most part, they're going two places. They're going to the Black Hills to fish, or they're going to northern Minnesota.
Okay.
There's a highway, I forget what the highway is called, that leads to Yellowstone that goes through South Dakota and the old, right? And so they're usually following that, or they're going home to visit family.
Okay. That's, not too surprising, but I mean, it's interesting that they publicize that. I'd be really curious to read some of that.
So there's a magazine called the Morrell Magazine, and given your work with those student yearbooks and everything, I mean, you would love it because the change is profound.
Sure.
In the 20s, it's all about vacations and we're all a family. And in the 50s and 60s, the magazine is primarily about what management is trying to do to stay abreast of the situation.
Yeah.
But you would really find them interesting given what you look at regularly.
I can imagine. I actually just got back from the Black Hills last week too. So not that that's relevant in any way, but we do have a question in the chat for you as well, Michael. The question reads, you mentioned the Sioux City strike. Is what happened at the Sioux Falls plant connected to the strikes in Austin, Minnesota at roughly the same period?
Actually, there's a lot of hostility between the Hormel workers in Austin, Minnesota, and the John Morrell workers in Sioux Falls. They asked, the strikes do occur at the same time. The Hormel workers were already paid less than the Sioux Falls workers because Austin was considered a rural community compared to Sioux Falls, and so wages in the master contract were less. So the strikes are happening at the same time. It's the same issues for Hormel that are happening in Sioux Falls. And the Sioux City strike is a different contract because when they broke the master labor contract, you now negotiate separately with every plant. And so in 1986, early 1987, there was an Arkansas City plant and the Sioux City plant went on strike. And the workers at John Morrell refused to cross picket lines that were set up by workers from these other cities at the Sioux Falls plant. And that's ultimately what the company sued the union on.
Interesting. So John, I have a question for you. In terms of your mention of the different conditions, and you're getting into some of the great details, about the lice and the other unfortunate circumstances. I wonder if you had a sense of how different those conditions were from the conditions that the men would have lived in during their everyday lives. Are these drastically different? Are they, comparable? Is that something that, that the workers aren't really unaccustomed to? How would you compare those things?
Yeah, for my purposes too, there's really like two sets. There's of lumberjacks. There's like professional part-time workers really engaging in the gig economy. You might be lumberjacks, and then they're going to be agricultural workers in the summer. So those people would be more accustomed to it. But also a large number of these that I really was particularly interested in were, farmers, or just, I guess they would be, just settlers or homesteaders really. Whether or not they'd be used to those conditions is probably a step down. And it's a step down basically just looking at any of the oral interviews. They're constantly talking about the poor conditions, the lice, how hot or cold it was, and that it's probable that it was something that was different for most of them. But there's that divide where it's, a professional part-time, they're going to do this and maybe work in a sawmill for a while, as opposed to more of the people I was looking at were more of the farmer going to work in the winter. They were the ones that especially found the conditions like, but they also found that they were the ones who needed the additional income, or they would have, their dream of being in a farm would have just not worked out. Never been. Yes.
Okay, we have another question in the chat for you, John. The question reads, I wondered if you found connections between workers and issues related to disability studies or disability history in terms of injuries and long-term health problems.
No, I've, and I also, another part of it was, of my dissertation is on miners. And I actually really look at a mining disaster where 41 people were flooded out in a mine. Because that, that's part of rural history as well, iron ore mining. And so I really, in terms of disability studies, what I was looking at there was more in terms of workman's compensation type of things. I never really looked at long-term health. I did look at long-term health of miners, and just some tragic stories. Like one guy in this mining incident, not to run away from your question, but it's just sticking with me. He went down the mines. He was 15, and his father was also a miner. The miner floods. The kid makes it out. The father doesn't. And the long-term effects, though, is that he ends up still working in an iron mine, and he's giving this oral interview literally on his deathbed because his lungs have given out because of red dust from iron ore. That would be interesting to look at in logging. I really appreciate that question. That's something I'll look at. I really do appreciate that. Thanks for bringing that up.
Good. Other questions for any of our presenters this afternoon?
Well, I have one for you.
Okay.
And that is, with the three you showed us, the kind of very clear public-private partnership and the more private entrepreneurial, look at us, Minneapolis, we're so great. Are you seeing a trend that is one of these models seem to dominate over another, or is it just random?
I don't really want to say that it's random. I would say that it's varied. It kind of depends on where the strength lay in the municipality prior to the Centennial. That is to say, certainly in Kansas City, there had been a little bit more governmental intervention or reform after Pendergast had faded away by 1950, whereas Omaha is still growing through, are they going to have home rule? Are they going to have a strong mayoral structure? What I've looked at in terms of Salt Lake City, to pull something out of the region in, they have a completely different model because Salt Lake City is celebrating not only the municipal centennial in 1947, but also the arrival of the Mormon pioneers. So they have the entire church backing. It's more of a statewide effort. And that's really one of the differences as well that determines how this is structured, is if the state at that level is also celebrating with the city. We don't see that in Minnesota or Kansas City. Omaha is going to be territorial statehood a little bit later, but if there's that kind of cooperation, that also influences the structure. No matter what the structure is, though, whether it's public, private, or like in Kansas City with the mayor on the committee, the business community is always front and center in the publications. The Chamber of Commerce always has a very prominent place. It always highlights homegrown businesses in terms of, look at Western Auto, it started here, now it's doing this. Or, look at Pillsbury, it started here, now it's doing this. So homegrown industry, and I use industry very broadly because that could be what we would think of as non-industrial, insurance or other kind of white collar jobs. But those kind of business interests are really, I would say, part and parcel of the purpose for the Centennial celebration. So that's not a silly question at all, Samantha. So one of the questions in chat for me, and I'm not skipping you, Corey, you can probably ask your question. There's only been a couple questions asked of Michael, so I don't think you'll repeat anything. But Samantha asked if there was any other centennials I'm interested in studying. So I have studied Salt Lake. I just didn't fit with the regional focus here. I want to look at Sioux Falls. It's a little bit closer, certainly, to where I'm at now. I have the Sioux Falls Centennial program as an eBay collection. And I've also talked to Jill, I see her in here on Twitter a couple ways about getting some of the archival materials. Seattle, I think, celebrates in 51. So there is a real regional sort of cross section. It's not just here in the center where these centennials happen, but I am limiting my study from about 45 to 60, really is about as late as I want to go, because I found that if it's a decade earlier, like Chicago, we're really dealing with Depression era spending, kind of that coming out of the 20s, planning into the Depression. And if it's post 60, the civil rights movement and the racial awareness is much different in terms of the tenor of these municipal celebrations. So I'm really limiting to that post-war decade, which I see as an opportunity for optimism that never is quite realized, but it's an important snapshot of what's happening. So Corey, did you have a question for Michael?
I did. Well, so actually, I think as I've thought about it a little more, perhaps, or hopefully, it's one that could be for the group. I had written down as you started, Dr. Mullen, the 87 strikes. I was really happy to hear you beating me to the punch on something with South Dakota labor history once again. But for the group more broadly, I think this question of kind of corporations, perhaps, in the image of the city that they're allowed to construct, what avenues does that leave for pushback against these images, right? That I'm talking about striking as kind of a way of pushing against a community that Morel has created. But in Minneapolis as well, I think you had Dr. Gann, you had the picture up there of the Twin Cities the rapid transit line, and those are cars that are being burned publicly, what, 5 years later from that Centennial too. Just some of the ways in which, how does pushback kind of enter this narrative? When do people question this idea of corporate philanthropy, if you want to think about it that way? How does that kind of challenge these Midwestern communities that we might, as we might think about them?
So one of the things I'm Corey, kind of wrestling with right now is the two strikes that I kind of talk about in Sioux Falls. There are profound changes occurring in the agricultural sector simultaneously, right? And so for the 1986-87 strike, farmers aren't particularly sympathetic, and workers in the Sioux Falls community aren't particularly sympathetic to this call, because I've got a financial crisis and you're closing the shop and I can't sell my animals. In the 30s, we're in that process of culling the herds because there's too many of them. And so there's that outside component. And if you read the Argus leader, there are a lot of people who are saying, I'm making it on $4.50 an hour. Why should I feel sorry for someone making $4 more an hour than I am, right? And that's kind of the pushback. In fact, Morel did a 1-hour television special to get its point across in the 1986 strike. And as always the case in the 80s, Morel threatened to pull the plant. We'll move it somewhere else, right? And in 1986, Morel's still the largest employer. So that's a threat that brought the governor into the conversation. So there is a lot of pushback that way. The 35 strike's a little bit different because the strike was actually over the worker saying, we'll take fewer hours if you don't fire people. That is, it was a collective, we'll work 30 hours a week as opposed to 36 just to keep people employed. And so there's that kind of sympathy that the workers were looking out for each other that was different than the 86 strike. So I hope that answered at least the strike question for you.
So Corey, I would say in terms of, the sense of pushback, when I started looking at the Centennial celebrations, it was an outgrowth of my dissertation, which had included part of Chester Franklin and the Kansas City Call. And Franklin retires in 1950 while the celebration is underway. And I had this sense in this prediction that the call was going to use the attention on Kansas City as an opportunity to highlight all the negative things that African Americans faced in the city because there was more focus in Kansas City during this celebration. And the inverse was absolutely true. The call was praising what was happening within the city. They were talking about how great it was. My introduction had a little bit from one of his editorials that essentially talked about Kansas City growing up, putting aside things like segregation and discrimination as it celebrated its 100-year anniversary. So what happens is that the civic leaders, Chamber of Commerce officials, people who run venues, who are charged with seating and tickets, they suspend segregation during the summer-long celebration to avoid any kind of racial strife. They don't want that to happen while the attention is focused on them, but immediately after, it goes right back to what it had always been. So there's this moment of sort of opportunity. Now, one thing that foreshadows this certainly in Kansas City is that about a couple decades earlier, when Kansas City hosts the Republican National Convention in 1928, they're going to be brought to task because they don't impanel African-American delegates alongside white delegates. So they learned from this lesson to apply it to the 50th Centennial to say, we want to take this step in order to avoid that kind of pushback. In other cities, certainly Omaha and Minneapolis, I don't see as much evidence of that kind of temporary cooperation. I also don't see that evidence of pushback. Largely, it's going to be a cooperation between labor leaders and these corporate interests to say publicizing the city benefits us all. In terms of we want to have Minneapolis or Omaha seen as positive and as progressive as possible, so we can keep growing, so we can all prosper in the future. Other questions? I know we've had our 10-minute warning. We have a few moments though, if anyone has another question that they would like to ask. I do just want to take a moment to thank everyone for coming. I know that we are the last session of what was a successful conference, and certainly in person world, the last session often is overlooked. So I think we may have benefited from the virtual opportunity here, but I do want to take a moment to thank everyone for sticking with us and coming. It's been a wonderful experience. Are there any other last minute questions?
Wait. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. John, one question that in some of the work that I'm doing is the connection between meatpacking and poverty in rural areas. And I'm wondering if that's an area that maybe also could be added to your challenge to we're all farmers out here. Because it seems to me like lumbering, right? We have a large number of immigrant population doing these jobs that they're recruited because they'll work for less. There is a dangerous job. It seems to have parallels to your lumberjacks. And so as you think about expanding it, I might be on the lookout for how some of these trends continue today with the meatpacking industry. It's not really a question, I apologize, but it's just something that struck me as you were talking. That what you raised, I've been reading an awful lot about in studies of other meatpacking plants.
All right. Well, I think maybe we've exhausted our questions. Megan had said thanks for everyone. I would echo that. Thank you for coming, but also presenting interesting papers. I think they fit well together. We got a cross section of both the region and the time involved. So have a good holiday weekend, everyone. This seems like a Friday, even if it's not, but close enough for me. So
thanks for sharing.
I will see all of you next year, I hope.
Yep.
Bye.
Thank you, Justin.